Number two, there's de minimis shareholder representation of the board. The board and the company and management have been a very significant net seller of stock. We'll talk about that further. The average tenure of the board is is almost 10 years. There's a lot of directors serving on multiple other boards. We'll talk about that as well. In terms of strategic errors, we think the board has made a couple of mistakes. One, the company was committed to holding on to its credit card business when there were other alternative structures where they could have their cake and eat it too. They could stay in the business of offering credit to their customers. They could touch the customer at all relevant points, preserving the brand. They could run the call center. They could be there at the point of sale, but they could shift the credit risk and shift the funding risk associated with their business. And Target, unlike almost every other retailer in the country, Kohl's, Walmart, Sears, and others, elected to stay in a business that is a high-risk business that consumes a large amount of capital. Even after we urged the company to exit the credit risk associated with this transaction, they hired Goldman Sachs and did what amounts to really a pure financing transaction. On the real estate side, we proposed a transaction. The company identified a number of concerns. We responded to those concerns. They said no, and they weren't willing to consider any other alternatives. They wouldn't open the process. They limited Goldman Sachs to a very narrow, does the Pershing plan make sense as proposed, or does it not make sense? Once Goldman concluded it didn't make sense, they weren't allowed to consider other alternatives. If I look at corporate governance, I think my biggest critique of the board is that there really doesn't seem to be a fair and open nominating process. We've been a 2-year shareholder of the company. We've had an extremely constructive, cordial relationship with the management of the business. We're a shareholder that has a track record for creating value in numerous other large situations. We're the 4th largest outright shareholder with the 3rd largest owner, including options. Yet they wouldn't deign to give us one seat on the board. And they wouldn't explain to us why I was not an acceptable candidate. When we proposed independent directors, they rejected them without meeting them. They never explained to us why they rejected the candidates that we proposed. If you look at compensation, there's been a lot of criticism about the compensation of senior executives of Target. We've heard this as we've met with many pension funds and others that are focused on this issue. And our issue really isn't so much compensation. We think for outstanding performance, executives are entitled to outstanding compensation. The biggest issue we have is a lack of a ownership culture. And we'll go into this in more detail. But management over the last 5 years has purchased 0 stock, senior management, 0 stock in the company, until one day after we nominated our slate, at which point Greg Steinhoffel bought stock for the first time. The company and the board have been very significant net sellers of stock. In terms of giving shareholders choice, we said, look, if you like candidates other than those on our slate, we want you to have the flexibility to vote for candidates on our slate as well as candidates on the company's, the current board slate. So let's have a universal proxy so you can pick among, and this was our corporate governance expert, Ron Gilson's suggestion. Let's have a universal proxy. We'll make things easy for shareholders. You won't have to show up at the annual meeting to vote for the candidates you want. The company turned us down. There are what we call interlocking directorships, and we'll go into that in more detail. But that's why we think the board needs change. One important point I want to make here is that the company has positioned this, or the board has positioned this, about Pershing Square or Bill Ackman versus management. I have a high regard for management. We would, if we were on the board, we'd be very supportive of management. We do think the board needs change, and that's what this is about. Okay, we've talked about missing expertise in retail, credit card, and real estate. Let's look at ownership. If you look at the independent directors, they own a total of 162,000 shares. That includes restricted stock grants. That includes any stock that they've purchased. This is a group of, for the most part, very successful, wealthy executives. They have the resources to make an investment in the company. They've been on the board with an 8, 9, 10-year average term. Over that period of time, you would expect them to become meaningful owners of the business. Even if you include options, the independent directors own 0.09% of the company. You notice that a small fraction of their total ownership is in the form of common stock, much greater percentages in the form of call options or derivatives. This is something the company has criticized us for because we own derivatives. I just want to point out here that both the management and the board have a greater percentage of their investment in the form of options than common stock. But again, it's very, very small ownership considering the affluence of the board, the period of time they've served on the board, and the fact that most of these stock and option investments are grants. The board didn't even reach into their own pocket to buy stock. If you look at the average tenure of the board, other than 2 years ago when a couple of candidates were added, most of the directors have been here for a very long period of time. When you see this, in my opinion, it's reflective of kind of a stale board or a company that, there's an article in the paper today that called Target an insular company. And I think insularity is a risk even for the best the best businesses. Sears, Roebuck and Company was a phenomenal retailer for a long period of time. It built the Sears Tower. It became inward-looking. It became insular, and it hurt the company. We don't want Target to become an insular company. We think fresh perspectives, fresh ideas are essential for the business to be successful. The credit card. We met with the company in August. We advocated over the course of the fall the company should exit the credit card business. We made multiple presentations about risks in the credit markets and where things were headed. We hired industry consultants to determine what transactions were available in the marketplace. Our consultants spoke to all of the relevant buyers, and the company, instead of pursuing a transaction where they could have taken the credit risk off the table, elected to go down the road of really a financing type transaction. As such, this is a much less interesting transaction for financial institutions. As a result, there's much less appetite to buy the company's receivables. On real estate, Target is a major owner of real estate, over 200 million square feet of very high quality, high density, urban, suburban located real estate. We think the replacement cost of the real estate is $40 billion. Value is probably a number similar to that. That's an enormous number relative to the enterprise value of the company today. We think there's an opportunity to unlock value here. We proposed one idea. We think there may be others. The company was not willing to look at anything other than what we proposed, and they looked at our idea in the most narrow fashion. Despite our efforts to get approval to work with Goldman Sachs to devise a better transaction, the company limited Goldman Sachs to a very narrow analysis of our transaction. On the nominating process, I mentioned before, Michael Ashner, Richard Vague were never even interviewed. The nominating committee chair would not tell me why our nominees were not eligible. Now, why would Steve Sanger why would he consider our nominees versus the company's nominees? I mean, one of the things we point out, just in terms of interlocking issues, Steve Sanger chairs Wells Fargo's compensation committee. Obviously, he's a guy that Richard Kovacevic has a very close relationship with. He gets paid to serve on that board. How can he recommend one of our nominees over Richard Kovacevic? How can he decide? Richard Kovacevic, while he's a terrific bank chairman, if it were decided that Richard Vague had better experience, he still couldn't push for Richard Vague over Richard Kovacevic because of that relationship. We think of the board as insular. There are some conflicts, as we point out, and they're clearly not receptive to shareholder input. In terms of governance, again, we've asked for a universal proxy card. The company turned us down. They said technologically it's problematic. We spoke to Broadridge, who handles the technology. They say they can do it if both parties are open to it. The company says it's too late. There's no reason why there couldn't be a ballot on the Internet where people can choose among which candidates they want. The company's not been supportive of it. They said it's too expensive. We say we'll pay the expense. They say it would cause delay and confusion. Actually limits confusion. It's just like ordering from a Chinese restaurant. Some from column A, some from column B. Liability, there really is no liability to Target or any of its nominees. So this is something important. We think if shareholders push for it, it will make for a fairer contest where people can more easily choose among the various candidates. This is a fairly stunning slide, and we only did this analysis in the last few days. The management has sold $419.7 million worth of stock in the last 5 years. That is an enormous number. The board has sold $8.8 million worth of stock over the last 5 years. That's also an enormous number. They've purchased only $3.8 million. So a total net sales on the board and management of $428 million worth of stock. This is not a board that has created a culture of ownership in the company. If you grade the board, what are the board's key functions? Well, one, hiring good management. Here we think they've done a good job. We like the management team. In terms of assessing strategic transactions, we think they made a mistake in approving a suboptimal transaction on the credit card side. We think they made a mistake in not opening up, looking at other alternatives for real estate and by limiting the work that Goldman Sachs was able to do. My sense is Goldman Sachs would love to do the kind of analysis that we would like them to do to see if there's another alternative for Target's real estate. You look at the companies got really pushed by the analyst community, investors for many, many years before the company ultimately made the strategically intelligent decision to exit Mervyn's and Marshall Fields. In terms of nominating directors, the board has continually renominated itself. You can tell that by the tenure of the board. They're missing key areas of expertise. I was actually on CNBC this morning with Nelson Peltz, and he was talking about how important it is to have directors who understand the business so that when the CEO calls up a director, not necessarily at a board meeting, but during the week,